wanted to talk about just stuff that's changed in TSQL lately that I find people don't seem to know about. And so, who I am, I'm part of SQL Down Under, and so started that. And the main mentor there, I kind of like the word mentor rather than consultant because my main aim is to sort of help people do things themselves rather than doing it for them most of the time. Long time, long-term MVP, 27 years so far, so this sort of feels like forever. Similar time for the regional director program, which just gets me on a whole lot of interesting mailing lists, right to the top of Microsoft, which is always interesting, and certified master, and I just write stuff, so all good. Another thing I do is podcasts, and John's been on one of those. And so, yeah, I've got SQL, Cosmos, Fabric, and Postgres. So, look, the things I want to run through, I'm going to have to, based on the time, it'll be pretty quick. So, what I'll mostly lean on doing is showing you stuff, more so than telling you and then showing you. So, a couple of first, so if we look at actually, just talking about the things there. So first up, I'll just show you stuff that are just different options I find people aren't aware of that weren't there before. Then there's a bunch of stuff that has changed out of things we're used to using. There's a whole lot of stuff that's been added around JSON, which is really everywhere. And then I'm going to spend a little bit of time at the end just showing you some vectors and REST and AI and where that's all fitting as well. So look, grab this, and so hopefully the screen is pretty good. Let's zoom it a little bit more. And what I want to show you quickly is I find people aren't familiar with is distinct from. And so if you look at this table here, there's a color column for the stock items, and a lot of them are null, and a bunch of them have colors as well. But if we parameterize the color, imagine that coming in from somewhere, and I said, look, give me the blue ones, and I mean, that clearly works fine. But the problem is, of course, if it's null. And so if I said, hey, that's null, I get nothing back. And of course, the problem is this, where I've said color equals that color, and that ain't going to work. So, because we have to be able to say where color is null. And so what people often try is they'll do this sort of thing. They'll use a function to wrap the parameter and replace it with an empty string, or same with the thing here. And I mean, that sort of works. The only thing is that whatever you put here is suddenly a magic value. And this is something you can't differentiate from null anymore. And that's not ideal. And it's also not brilliant often execution platforms. But a thing that's a little more correct would have been to say where color equals or color is null and our color is null. And I mean, that'll work. And a lot of the tools do exactly that. But what we really wanted was, instead of an equal, we wanted an equivalence. And that's what's provided. There was an ANC option for this forever. And we've just been wanting SQL Server, and it's there. So we can now say where color is not distinct from color. And so if we do that, that's fine. You know, if I drop out the initialized value, that'll happily find the null ones as well. And it just works absolutely as you expect. The only thing with this, the weird thing about this one, is that we nearly always use the negative of it. It's actually kind of rare to use the is distinct from instead. But what I would really like to see is, I wish there was some sort of shortcut thing that we could put, so where we could say something like where color equals color. I've been trying to talk the team into that because that's a lot more pleasant than the whole is not distinct from option. But regardless, in MySQL, they have an option where they use less than, equal, greater than, and does the same thing. And so that's kind of cool. Now, the only thing is, if you execute and you use is distinct from, and you use it across a linked server to a version that doesn't have is distinct from, then what SQL Server does under the covers is it auto-magically translates it to this mess. And that's what ends up getting sent across to the link server. So if you see that turning up on a link server, you think, what on earth is that? It can be, and it is distinct from, or is not distinct from, being sent across a link server. Now, another one to mention is generate series. And so this is another thing we've been wanting for a long time. People wanted generally like a table of numbers, something like that, because it's a common requirement to have that. And generate series, what that does, it's a bit like a for loop in another language. So I can say, give me the values from 1 to 10, and that'll just give me 1 to 10. That's fine. I can add a step value, like I can with most for loops and other languages. So 1, 5, 9, and the next one's going to be bigger than 10, so it stops. But what I really like with this is this here. If I say, look, with values to return, and I say, go and get me 1,000 values, and then I say, select from that, this is the sort of thing that would normally mess up SQL Server's optimizer. And mostly because whenever you have a function like this, it generally has no idea about cardinality. But just note here that if I look at the plan for this, then it actually knows that there's 1,000 rows coming back out of that, which is kind of cool, the fact that they've done that. It's also a bit funky with the data type. Notice if I said from 0 to 10, 5.1, then it'll blow up. What it wants is it wants all of these to the same data type. So it will take decimal values. That does work. And the other thing we often do is combine it with other things to get other data type. So I said from 1 to 100, and then just, I don't know, stick it in date add or something. And then I can use that to get the next 100 days. That works good. Or I could say, look, add it to an A to give me the letters of the alphabet and stuff. So there's obviously things I can do with other data types to get around. Another thing that's been done in recent values, and so these ones so far are just 2022. And so what we've got in here is date truncation. I find people are quite unaware of that. And so if I had some value, and previously I wanted to truncate that to the nearest minute, then and maybe it's coming in a transaction timestamp or something, and I just want to record it to the minute level. The question is, what do you do? And previously, what I would do is I would say something like date time from parts, and I would then have to pull out the year, the month, the day. But then, of course, we don't have hour and minute as function, so I'd have to use date part to go and get the hour and minute, and then say that 0 seconds and milliseconds. And I mean, you know, that works. It's just not a pretty thing that I'm using. And so it's now much easier because what you can do is say truncate the dates using date trunc, and you can just say the level you want to truncate it to. So I can say, look, give me that and truncate that for the minute. That's exactly what we're doing. And so this is actually really, really good. One of the things that we used to do all the time before was truncating things, say, for the month. Because if I had transactions and I wanted to say which month did they fall in, then I could run code again with date from parts and say, here's the beginning of the month, every one for the month. But again, that now can just be date from month, and that same thing is going to work just fine. So that's actually, I think it's better because it gives you a much clearer intent as well as what you're doing. One of the weird things with this is that it has a dynamic output data type. And this is something you can't do yourself when you're building T-SQL functions. It's the sort of thing I wish I could. But the data type that comes out depends upon the data type coming in. So it doesn't just return like a data time 2 or something every time. The value coming back depends upon the data type being passed in. And it also won't let you go below the input type. So if I said, look, here's a date, I want to truncate that to the minute, it's going to go, no. You can't do that for the minute type date. Another one that's interesting with this date truncation is date bucket. And we use this quite a bit too. So what this allows you to do is take things that have dates and times and then categorize them into buckets of time of a specific length. And so if I could use that in place of date truncate. So if I just said, now here's the date and time value, stick it in a bucket 1 minute long, based on the value, it would just actually truncate it to the minute. So I mean, that in fact they could have just used that instead for date truncate. It doesn't support ISO week, but where this gets a little more powerful is you can also set something which is the origin of the date bucket to create. So in this case here, I'm saying take a value and I'm saying break it into chunks that are a week long, but then starting at a particular day. And in this case, it's really just the day of the week. So up here, I've just picked any Wednesday at all, and that's just the date I know is a Wednesday. And this will then carve the date up and give it to me in the weeks, starting on Wednesdays, without fiddling with any of the things at the session level and stuff like that. And where it's more powerful, so you can do this sort of thing. I could say, I want to carve the times during the day up into 2-hour chunks. But the 2-hour chunks start at 15 minutes past the hour. And so if I take a value like this, I can just give it an offset of anything where I've got 15 minutes past the hour. Then I can say, give me 2-hour chunks of that value, carve that up into 2 hours, allocate it into 2 hours, where I start with this as the offset. And so if I do that, that says 12:15 on that day is where the 2-hour chunk started that included this date. And so this can do wickedly powerful stuff. This is date time. Now, there's also a little step, there's approximate percentiles. And so we've had in quite a few versions. We've had percentile quant and percentile discrete. In fact, I think they were probably 2008 where they first appeared. The other thing is they're really heavy to do calculations on these things. And so sometimes what you want is you want a value that's close enough. And so it's similar to we had distinct count, and nowadays we have approximate distinct count. And that's really powerful because perhaps all I'm doing is counting the number of customers or distinct customers that are in a pile of orders because I want to show a progress bar on the screen or something like that. I don't really care if it's 13,612 or whether it's 13,600 of them. I mean, it'll make no difference to my progress bar. So I just want to know roughly what that number looks like. And the approximate functions let you do that, and they're so much faster. And they also have an algorithm they use to do this work, where it's basically within a couple of percent anyway, the answer. And so where we had percentile continuous before, we've now got the approximate version of the same thing. And we've got the approximate version of percentile discrete. Another really big change is named windows. And what this is about is that we had the over clause, we've had that since 2008, and, in fact, 2005. And so we had something like this, where I could say row number over order by stock item as row number, and I can output that. And that's just the standard over clause, where basically I'm saying, give me out a number here, and this is the order that I'm allocating the numbers in, which can be different to the order that I'm then sorting the rows back out. Sure. And so I could rearrange that by using a window function. So the most basic thing I can do is I could say by stock item, as in a window, this considers, that means order by stock item. And then what I can do up here is I can say row number over by stock item, which window clause, and that'll do exactly the same thing as the code did before. But the difference is that when I declare a named window like this, I can reuse that all over the place in the query, rather than just having to every time redefine what this means. And of course, that becomes much more powerful as this becomes more complicated. And so here's an example of just reusing the same window. So I can say, select an invoice ID, and from invoice lines, and I'm saying for invoice ID is the window where I said petition by invoice ID. And now, instead of having to say over petition by invoice ID, so on and so on, I can just say sum of extended price over each invoice, basically an average and minimum, and so on. And so that allows me to reuse that as a concept. Another thing I can do with this, though, it doesn't stop there. What I can also do is I can use a window to redefine another window. So I can say here window for invoice ID as petition list by invoice. Then I can say for invoice ID by stock item as that window clause up here. I can say use that same one and then add order by to that. And then once I do that, I've then got two options open. So I can say give me the sum of the extended price over the invoice, but give me a row number that then does it by stock item within the invoice, and so on. And so this is just the ability to add a name to these over clauses, but you can then have one over clause relate to another over clause. So they don't even have to be done in the right order in here. You can do it in different orders. So I can then do things like this, where I've said window for invoice line ID as petition by invoice line, order by invoice line ID. And then I've said for rolling invoice line as take that previous one and then add a clause saying it rows between unbounded preceding and the current row. And that'll get me a sort of a, year to date or the rows to date or something like that option. And then if I do that, I can then use those in the select. And so note here, I've then got a rolling total price. And so in the case of this invoice number, where it's number 2, I've got this is the first row, and then these are the 2 rows. Of course, this is then the rolling total that comes out of that. So this just allows you to do a whole lot of really, really interesting stuff. Just to make sure I go back to master regardless, because sometimes this hangs on to things, unfortunately, in management studio. There's also some handling of strings and Unicode strings. So we've now got the ability to use a different string concatenation. This is one that's very common, of course, in many other database engines. They use the type symbol rather than the plus. Many of them think plus was a mistake because clearly that's used for adding things up. And if you had numbers in the strings, for example, it starts to get ambiguous as to what on earth you're talking about. So note here, I've said hello there, and if I just do that, then that's basically, it's exactly the same. So it's just a string concatenation operator. Note if I do it with null, then if I set hello and null on there, then this would return null, right? So the question is, what does that do? Well, it does the same thing, right? But one of the things that is different about this is that you can set a concat null yields null off, and that's a session value that I would never normally set, but you can set it. And you'll notice that if you do set that, then what I'm saying is I don't want this null stuffing up my concatenation. But notice that we now get a different outcome. So it's not exactly the same as the plus. So it ignores this second. I don't know if I love that as a concept, but anyway, that's what it does. It doesn't work exactly the same. It does have the type equals operator. So I can say set the value type equals there. And so it just says append that on to the end of the string. Same as if I'd said set value equals value type there. That's fine. It also works with binary strings. So note here I've got 0x, 1a, 1a, and I've stuck 2b on the end. And that works just as we expect. So it's kind of sweet. It does do an implicit pass to string, regardless of where it is. So note here I said hello there and then a 5. And if I select that, then I do get back hello there and a 5 on the end. And this was the one where it gets a little trickier because normally when SQL Server sees a 5 as the first thing, and then you start going plus, it goes, hang on a sec, that's not what I'm looking for. But of course, the beauty is because it knows this is a string operator, then it will immediately pass that to a string instead of fiddling around with it as a number. We've also had the ability now to do work with emojis, and they've given us the ability to do these easily. Before you had to create character pairs to do this, it still requires UTF-8 inputs. And note here, this new function, if I do that, it says, hang on, that needs to be UTF-8. But notice here, if I just put an M in front and make it Unicode string, and I've said D8 and so on, that character pair returns a little N. Right? So that's kind of cool. I'm a big fan of this. I have a huge fiberglass one. Well, it's huge, probably 5 feet tall in the backyard. Anyway, so it's a little bit of a local joke. Anyway, and then there's also the ability, instead of here using the backslash as the escape character, you can also change that. I can say, look, for some reason, the string I'm sending in, I just want to use an @ sign instead, and find that works exactly the same. 2025 added some regular expression. So let me show you this. I'll just add in here. I've got a couple of schemas on that if they're not already there. Good. And just create a context table. Stick a whole bunch of people in it. I'll show you this. So if I say, look, let's have a look at this. So I just picked things that are, the casing is all over the place. There's a few different things with this and so on. So the most basic stuff I can do is I can now use regular expression like. And note that goes in a where clause. And the thing that's sort of interesting with this is to say to yourself, what data type does this return? And notice that in SQL Server, we don't have a Boolean data type. But that's how you use this. And I wish we did have a Boolean data type, but everything else, like, is numeric. Things like that, they return a number. And you normally go equals 1 or equals 0 and so on. This is not like that. So I'm hoping that's actually the beginning of having a real Boolean data type. But anyway, so I could say here, here's a pattern. Now, the caret and the $sign, in this case, are saying this is the beginning and end of where the pattern occurs. A to Z or A to Z, so it's a letter in between that, or a lowercase one, number. And then I've got other options. It can be a dot, an underscore, a percent, a plus, or a minus. That's actually escape. And then we've got another one again, and then so an @ sign, and then we've got at least 2 parts to the domain inside that. That's not a perfect URL match, but, an email address match based on the RFC, but it's pretty close. And so if I did that, then that'll actually go in and sort of pull out things where it does actually look like an email. And we also have the ability to do things like count the number of places tag occurs. So note here what I've got in these nodes, I've got hash priority, hash case, hash case, hash case, and so on here. If I wanted to find those, and I wanted to find all of them, then that's actually a bit messy in TSQL today with string handling. But notice I can say regular expression count in that column, and then what I'm looking for here is describing what the tag looks like. So it looks like this, followed by potentially some characters. The plus says one or more, and this is position so. So if I do that, then notice this is saying there's two tags here, one tag here, one tag here, and so on. So the first thing I can do is I can count tags. Another thing I can do is I've got the preferences here, but notice that the limiters are all over the place, the spacing. Anyway, it's a bit of a mess. But what I can now do is I can pull regular expression split to table, and I've actually done this as a cross apply because I want to get each one of these now as a row. So I can then get the preference out of it by saying take the preferences, here are the limiters, and this is actually the case sensitivity of this thing here, and I execute that. That'll then go off and get these values out of it and an ordinate position for each one of those. So split the table is powerful. And similarly, there's regular expression matches where I can do the same sort of thing for those tags. And so where I had the tags here, and if I do the same cross apply but with the regular expression match, I can use that to extract the match cases of the tag values. This stuff's very powerful where that's at. So anyway, look, that's been added in 2025. Also in 2022, they gave us the ability to manipulate bits. And so this is, you wouldn't do this a lot, but if you're writing utilities and stuff, this is something people often want to do. And if I take a value like 5, I'm going to go like this, and I just shift that 2 bits to the left, of course I end up with this instead. And so that's going to be 20. So it's the same as multiplying by 4. There is a synonym operator. So curiously, they gave us one for this, but not one for is not distinct from. Okay. But you can use it as an operator instead of using it as a function. And so that does the same thing. You can also do bit count the number of bits. No surprise. But of course, if you've got negative values where they're all going to be a whole lot of ones, followed by a few zeros along the way, that's a different story. So even though all of these are minus 5, if it's a small int or an int or a big int, of course the number of bits is going to be different. Also here, you can set bits. I can say in this value, at this position, set that to a 1. So if I try that, notice it goes rack off, don't like it. And it's because the bit range is out of the range, the bit number is out of the range 0 to 31. This one actually annoys me because I understand why they do it, because normally when they work with sort of arrays, the array starts at 0, but every other array in SQL Server starts at 1. And so I look at that and go, it's the other thing about consulting. You come in and you want to change it. Where the mature consultant comes in and goes, I don't like the current pattern, but they continue it. And so the same thing. If I actually set a bit, yep, no problem, as long as I'm staying in that range of positions. There's also the get a bit, and of course, again, that's a one post. Greatest and least appeared, and I've been using these a lot. I love these. And so all this is something that would have previously been a big case study in many cases. So if I said, look, here's a list of values, of course they can be in different columns out of a row or something like that, And I said, give me the greatest value of that. So it's like, cool, 19 is the biggest value. But notice it returned it as a decimal value. And there was only one of them as a decimal. So it's promoting the data type to get to what you want. If there's a null in there, then I still get a 1 as the least value. Null isn't considered up at the top or the bottom or anything. It is ignored, like it is in most aggregates. It's the same thing. This works with strings as well, so it can do obviously alphabetically the greatest is there. Dates you've got to be a little bit careful about, right? Because it has no idea if that's a date or a string. And so by default, that's going to go, hey, the biggest thing there, alphabetically, is this one, unrelated to the date value. So as long as you turn them into date stuff, then that works just as you'd expect. Now, previously, what this does is it replaces code that was sort of messy. So if I said before, I've got stock items, and there's a discount price and a unit price. So I've said, case when the discount price is less than the unit, then give them the discount price. Otherwise, give them the unit price and so on. I mean, that's how that works. But what I can do now is I can say, look, select, and then just the least of the unit price, the discount price, the sale price, the agent price, the wholesale price, or whatever. So just give them the smallest one that they're entitled to. And of course, it ignores any of these that don't have values because they know. This is really, really powerful. I like this because you can imagine what the case statement would have looked like before. I mean, this is fine with a couple, but if you start having 3 or 4 columns, that would be just an astonishing mess. So this is really punchy. Also, with string splits along the way, that got enhanced because what we had before, we had initially the ability to split a string and say, look, based on a space, go off and split that. And that did the job. But the thing is, you had no guarantee that the words here would come back in the same order that they were in the string, because this is a table function. It doesn't by default have an order, it's a table. And so what they added initially was the ability to say, and give me an ordinal position. And when you do that, you get the ordinal value. And of course, and that says which position was it in the string. And of course, that's most commonly used to order the values. So that's fine. But where I tend to use it a lot now is to get a specific coding. So I can say, look, give me a string split where I get the ordinal, but where the ordinal is 3. So go and get me the third word. That's punchy. Now, the thing I don't want is this. Notice if I said, look, I actually want every character. It goes, no. So separators have to be n-char1 or n-char1. I wish that wasn't the case, because sometimes I just want every single character as a value coming back. And the other thing is sometimes I have separators that are a pain in the neck. So maybe it's 2 characters or something like that. And again, that's not going to work. I don't know why they make it as limited as it is. Trim also changed. This is one that people aren't aware of. I think ever since I started working with SQL Server, people used to say, why isn't there a trim function? It used to be L trim and R trim. And I think most of us had muscle memory where we just write L trim bracket R trim all the time. And so eventually they go to trim function. But if we look at what that does, if I just output greater than, less than, and then trim with no, then no surprise what that does, that just trims it. But what you can now do, they enhance this to be more ANSI or ISO compliant. And what I can say is I can say, look, give me a value out, but trim leaving space from the value or trailing space, or you can say both. And so that works. But where it's more interesting is where you give it a list of characters. So I can say trim asterisk dollar spaces from the value. So I've got something like this coming in, and then I can use that to just pull out the data. And where this is really powerful for me is these are a list of all of the white space characters that are the normal space plus tabs and paragraph returns and line feeds and all of the Unicode of those. I can sort of build up a string like that, and then I can say use that as a list of characters that I want to trim off a string. And so I've started with a test string, paragraph returns, and stuff and things all over the place. I can just say trim that list of characters from there, and it does it. This is a great example too of why I wish we had the ability to declare constants in TSQL. We don't have that ability, but this is the sort of thing I wish I could just declare somewhere and be done with it and use it all over the place. Substring also changed. And so previously with substring, we had string, and then we had starting position, one base, and then we had how much of the string you want. And one of the challenges all the time is it was hard to know what that number should be. But because it depended on, sometimes you just wanted the whole rest of the string. And it's okay if you just want 5 characters, 3 or something like that. So often what people would do is they'd stick a length function here where they then repeated the value. That's a pain in the neck. So what you can do with substring methods, you can just say a starting position and no ending, it's a number of characters, and it'll just give you the rest of the string. All right, now another thing is null treatment in window calls. So what we had here is, imagine I've got a list of stock items and I'm after one sort of, let's say, color, and then I'm actually partitioning this by price. So if you go down the list of prices, I've got values here, but notice that sometimes first value where it hit 25, that value was 9. So if you're looking at a window of value and you're saying, give me, I don't know, the first thing for a customer, the problem is you often don't want it if the row is 9. The same with lambda. So what we can now do, obviously, in IntelliSense, is absolutely no idea what's going on at the moment still, but you can say ignore nulls over and then do your partition and whatever. And what you'll find then is it'll find the first or last or whatever non-null value. And that's a nice punchy little picture. We had JSON support started, and a couple of things. First up, we didn't have in 2022, we got a whole lot of JSON functions, but we didn't have a JSON data. You'll find that one of the things the SQL Server team was very hesitant to do was add new data type. And because nowadays, if you add a new data type, it's not just adding the data type. They have to do all the work on all of the client libraries and all of those things. And it's a right pain in the neck getting all of that done. And so they tend to try and avoid it. So in the case of JSON, what they were doing is they just said, look, we'll just use it as a string and we'll give you a whole bunch of JSON functions. Now, examples of these, they gave us is JSON. I just want to point out that I never use these functions like is numeric and so on. And because the problem is it's not specific to a data type. And I just want to mention that since 2012, if you're still using is numeric stuff around or is date, don't do that. Right? What you want to do instead is use the try cast. Try and cast it to the specific data type you want, and then see if that value is null or whether you get a value. And of course, that's far better than the loose stuff you get with is numeric and so on. But even that helps with, we didn't have an is XML function, even though like they gave us so much XML stuff, but we didn't get the option to do that. But what we can do, of course, is try and pass something to XML and get null back if it's not valid XML. Cool, that's good. But ironically, they did give us an is JSON, even though we didn't have a JSON data type. And so but that's kind of odd. But anyway, so I can query the stock items table and say, is the color or the custom fields, are they JSON or not? And when I built wide world imports, I did put a bunch of JSON stuff in some of the custom fields. All right. So what we can do though is we can check for specific JSON types. So I can say not just is it JSON, but is it an array? Or is it a variable? Is it an object? Or is it a scalar value? So you can check that specifically. So now know within that column was actually an object. Now, there's things you can use to get around the lack of a JSON data type, but nowadays we have a JSON data type. And so I added in wide world imports for people. I added in a column here where it's got things like other languages and so on. So one of the things is that you might want to know, does a particular value appear? So notice this one's null, this one's other languages. But I might have valid JSON that might not have that value. So one of the problems before is if you said, go and get me the value, and if the value wasn't there, you got back null. But if the value was there, you got the value null. And so you didn't know the difference. So you didn't know if it was there and it was null, or whether it was just missing. And so now we've got the option to say, does the path exist? And so it's given us that ability as well. We also have the ability to construct JSON. So we can say, give me a JSON array. That'll just give you back open square bracket, close square bracket. Here's an array of values. Square brackets with values there. Mixture of data types is okay because this is just an array of values. If I have null, I have control over how that works. And so notice here I've got two values, but the middle one is null. And so the default is it just leaves it out. But I can also specifically require that by saying absent on null. And that is the default, but I can also say null on null. And in that case, I get back the null value. When I use this in a query, I can say, give me a JSON array with a bunch of the data about my databases. I can construct an empty JSON object, so with squiggly brackets instead, and say name, Greg, role, consultant. And that'll give me back a little chunk of JSON where I've got entity attribute value pairs there. And I can do this. So I can nest it up. So give me an object, name, Greg, role, languages as a JSON array within that. So English proficient, Mandarin, yeah, could be better. On stuff. And that'll turn me back JSON object based on that. Yeah, I can use that for query output. So I can say, look, go and get me all the details of a particular database. But I could combine that with a for JSON path. It goes up to the order line in this case. And I can say, give me back a chunk where I've got all of the databases, a big JSON array with each one of them returned as an object and so on. Super powerful. It can't serialize all the data types automatically at the moment. That annoys me. Notice here it says, hang on, CLR object and things. No, I'm not happy. But the thing that's frustrating with that is the CLR types all have to implement a toString method. So there's no reason you couldn't have just pulled toString on any object they don't know about. And that would have worked. So I don't know why that actually did.
Hey, Greg, I do have a question. It's John.
Yes.
How about indexing on JSON? It's supported. Have you used it yet?
It's pretty loose the way it works. Unfortunately, what we normally do with JSON most of the time is we normally promote values out of the JSON and then index those instead.
To make another column that has the key value you're trying to index.
Yeah, basically.
Okay.
And I'm usually much happier with that. So then we have the vector data type. And so note here, just creating a table for example instances. And what I'm doing here, I'm inserting some arrays. So notice this is a vector data type, and that says it has 4 dimensions. That's important. So if I insert that, that's all good. And then if I look at the data type coming back, it does return these looking like JSON array. Now, you can't insert the wrong number of dimensions. So note here that I said this was a 4-dimension vector. And so if I try and insert a value of 3 dimensions, it just says, no, the vector dimensions 4 and 3 don't match. So there's no automatic adding the value or anything. You have to have a valid JSON array as the string. You can't just like stick a bunch of numbers in and just says, hey, that's not JSON. And curiously, if you look at the data type for the JSON, what intrigued me is the system type ID. And if you look at the system type IDs for 165, so it's actually binary internally the way that's stored. Right? And you can also determine things like the base type. So they've given us a vector property function, again, which IntelliSense doesn't know about. And I can say, give me the base type, and that says this is a float 32, and that's the default. And you can also put dimensions in here, and that would return the number of dimensions. There is an option if you've enabled preview features to say, look, I want to declare a vector data type with 6 dimensions, but I want to use float 16 as the internal type. So half the resolution, so it makes things a lot smaller, and that works. But that won't work unless you have preview features enabled. Now, where this stuff becomes interesting is REST-based calls. So a little while back, we got the ability to make a call to the SP invoke external REST endpoint. And that was mostly in Azure SQL Database, but that's in SQL Server now as well. So I can make a call out to a REST endpoint. In this case, I'm saying a get method. That's the dummy address I'm going to. I said I want JSON back, and grab a response and return it. So I can do this, and that'll actually just go off and execute a REST endpoint. Notice I get a status code 200 back. That's happy and understand. Now, what I can also do, in my case, I have Olama running on my machine. And so that's an open source application that allows you to run AI models on the machine. And I have some text embedding models that basically just take a bunch of text and give you back a bunch of vectors. And so I've got a few of them on the machine. And then I have another thing called Caddy, and that's because when you make a call out, SQL Server will not let you call an HTTP endpoint, which is what comes back from OLAMA. So I've also put in a thing called Caddy as an HTTP proxy where I'm catching the calls and redirecting them to OLAMA. So anyway, there's a few things that involve. But at this point, I can call out with a post to my Olama system via Caddy. Then what I can say, so I can say the payload is go and use the model called all mini LM. It's the language model. And that's a model that takes text and returns it back as 384 dimensions. And here's the prompt that I want to use. And I can say, look, just go and do that. And what that'll return is then a response here Drag that out.
So you're trying to demonstrate vectorization of a
Of a
arrays
string.
into vectors, right? String into vectors for LLM. Cool.
Correct. And so that'll actually go off and hit the endpoint and do that. So now what we can do, instead of writing all of this sort of stuff all the time, is they've given us the ability to create an external model, which I call all mini LM, owned by DVO in my case. And then I've said, this is the address we go to. This is the API format. So notice how to call the Llama, various things with OpenAI. There's a list of them which you can use. The model type is an embeddings model. That's the only allowable value at the moment. And so whenever you see a parameter that only has one possible value, you can overthink of something else. And then I can say this is the model I want. So I can create that as an external model. And once I do that, it becomes easier to use. So I can say select AI generate embeddings. Here's the string. SQL Server loves AI. Use model all in the LM. And so that returns me back the JSON array where I've got the 384 dimensions of the value. And so I can use that then in a product table I've got. So I'm dropping an index if it's already there, adding a column for product vector, adding a column that's just in the table, that's still sort of, it's not there. And this, I've already added that. Okay. So once I've done that, I can, for each product in my products table, I can add product name embeddings by saying update that, go off and generate the embeddings for those products. I'll take a second or so. And what I can then do is, if I want, I can create a vector index, a create vector index on products using a cosine metric. You can do Euclidean or dot, and this is just nearest neighbor stuff, and limit it to max.4 while creating the index. Otherwise, it's heavy. Once I do that, I can then do language model style searches. So notice what I'm doing here. I've said go and find the embedded. So find the product one, and then give me the top 5 from vector search based on the products table with the column product name embeddings that are similar to the value that I retrieved here using cosine limited top 5. And when I do that, this is the original thing. It says organic Italian tomato passata, but that has now matched to these. Now think about how on earth you would do that in TSQL normally. There's just no chance of getting anywhere close to that. And so I can now do things like, say, natural tomatoes from Italy. And then I can say, go and do the search based on that user embeddings. And here are the return values from that. And so that's an astonishing match for that data. And so on. And so I just can't tell you how powerful these things are.
Almost like full text indexing on steroids.
Yeah, but it's so much richer than full text, because the difference is it understands the language, and that's it's just amazing. And like the final thing is there's a bunch of vector functions as well. And so if we look at these, first up, vector distance, so I can do how far apart are two vectors. So cosine, Euclidean, and dot. And these are just different ways of doing a calculation. Now, they're the same value, but the distance is calculated differently. The dot one does a dot product. The other one is looking at distance. There's a concept of a vector norm, and that does effectively a sum of the absolute values of that in the first one. So this is based on a norm type. Norm 2 is the square root of the sum of the squares. And the third one, norm infinity, basically is the maximum absolute value of any of the values in there. This one here, vector normalized, takes a vector and returns you back a unit sized vector on the same thing. Those anymore. Did that? No, that's all good. Hopefully, I can give you a copy of the slides because there's a lot of stuff. But based on the timing that we went through, let's quickly check if there's anything else that's in here that I didn't show you. Relations. Oh yeah, they did add base 64 handling as well when we're working bits. So there's base 64 in code and decode. Again, doing that before required CLR code. They've added string distance and similarity functions. So there's edit distance, which is the number of changes you have to make to a string to get to the other string. And that's often called 11 shift distance. They added Jarrow Winkler distance. And so this is how similar strings are based on a match from the beginning of the strings. And then they have provided similarity functions that tell you how similar strings are based on each of those different functions. And of course, we've got the JSON data type. We've got JSON arrays and JSON object aggregates as well. And that's pretty much where it's at. So look, based on that, TSQL is still evolving. It's funny, people seem to think it's dead for some reason, or like it's not being developed. It absolutely is. It's still a really valuable skill in the marketplace. 2025 obviously adds a lot of options, and if you like trying things out early, Azure SQL DB is the place to do it, because all of the things end up there before they end up in SQL. And of course, there's a ton more. And so, look, thank you. Contact for me, greg@sql.honor.com. I've got a bunch of free stuff up at /free stuff at the site. So there's SDU there's ebooks, there's a we've done a massive update to the SQL Server Management Studio tips and tricks ebook that's up there and stuff, with podcasts up there, including people like John. And my blog is there, blog.blog. And of course, I have free and online on-demand training where we've got TSQL classes, I've got advanced TSQL, and we've got AI features that has recently been added. And that, of course, takes you through that at a normal rather than just showing all the stuff really, really quickly like we just did.